Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. We're hoping you'll let us know where we think you got it right and where we totally missed the point, which you can do by visiting unsilentpodcast.com. Let's get into it. So, Brian, you and I were talking a little bit ago about how we seem to have a problem in our society focusing on big societal issues, and we make issues into big societal issues that past generations would have thought, what are you even thinking about?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's we the place I'm at right now, Tacoma, Washington. There's a homeless camp right across from my office here that looks like the homeless camp looks. There are regularly on my way home piles of garbage along the street that nobody seems to want to do anything about, which used to be a main government priority, is like keeping the physical plant, if you will, of the county in good shape. Potholes, I mean, just the basic stuff seems to be ignored, whereas we have a lot of focus on things that I think a majority of people wouldn't even think of as serious issues. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think I agree with you 100%. I mean, before I escaped from the People's Republic of Washington,
Yes.
I was subjected to that all the time. Now, we still have a place up there, so we go up there. I'm there a handful of times a year. Used to be arguably the most beautiful place in the country.
Yeah.
It
Yes.
was clean, it was green, it was pretty, it was well kept, and people prided themselves on that image. And not just there, but everywhere. It seems like it's kind of a multi-pronged effect thing to me. One is anything your parents or grandparents liked, we don't respect or we don't regard it in
Sure.
a high regard at all or whatever. So even things like kids getting passing grades in school, even things like not having just garbage on the streets, even
Right.
things like basic decorum and politeness,
Right.
things that don't cost anything to do, and things that do cost to do because they're worth the investment. So it seems like anything that your parents or grandparents valued, like we have to diminish that, and we will not
Sure.
hold that in high regard. And then the second part of it is, I think, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know how this stuff works, but it seems to me that looking back 40 years ago, when I was young, and my understanding of what it was like not long before that, let's say 60 years ago, we kind of went through this phase in the 60s and 70s where the boring stuff became the boring stuff. The stuff that's, but in the 40s and 50s, that was the stuff that established us as a world power.
Sure. Yeah,
Education, politeness, being on time, like these kinds of things are the behaviors that established us as a dominant force in the world,
right.
And a society that people would risk their lives to come be a part of. Well, through the 60s and 70s and even the 80s and 90s, of course, beyond, but if that stuff became boring, and what was exciting was whatever the new thing was. And at first, the new thing generated some really good ideas, like the personal computer, for example,
Sure.
and electric cars, and like there's elements of that produce really cool things when you allow yourself to kind of think outside the box, as the old cliche, right? But we've gotten to the land of absurdity, where the benchmark is how new the idea is, not how good the idea is.
Sure.
So that's the second part of it. And what do you what are your thoughts on those two things?
Well, so I think there's always a tendency or a drive for one generation to say we're not like the previous generation. So I think there's always that tendency, and it's always been the case. So, the children of the 60s weren't too much interested in the big band era music. So they had their own music. They rebelled against that. The children of the 80s weren't too excited about the rock music of the 60s and the Flower Children. And so, we had punk punk rock and we had grunge and all that. So, so there's always been, I think that's a feature of generational transition, right? I think that always happens. But it seems to me that it's even more than that now. It seems to me it's on a different scale than that now. So
Yeah.
even in those situations, I don't think you could have looked at any generation and said, well, um, crime is not a big deal. In fact, it's such a small deal in comparison with how people's feelings are, that we're not going to actually even put anybody in jail anymore, because it's just,
Right.
they've had bad circumstances in life. We're not going to put them in jail anymore. Crime is so small on a societal value, or on a scale that at least some people think
Of
should be the
importance.
absolute
Yeah.
scale. Yeah, it's not at all pursued. And so I think even throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, throughout all of our generations, crime was looked at as, yeah, this is bad. You shouldn't go steal somebody's car, whether you're a hippie, whether
Well,
you're a punk rock or
I think
whatever.
that the people in charge thought that, but there was a number of people who were not in charge who thought, like, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and we could be hippies, and if you borrow somebody's stuff for a while, that sucks, but
Right.
sucks for them. But the people in charge didn't think that way. The people in charge still did have this they did value those things
Sure.
that that matter, like fixing potholes and education. You would have individuals who were kind of the fringe, who would not didn't think that stuff was important and live their lifestyles in accordance with that belief that it was not
Right.
important. And then it became a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more mainstream, but there's still people in charge who said, yeah, okay, fine, you can have your weed and you can have your same-sex marriage, you can have all the things that we previously deemed, you know, wrong, for lack of a better word. You can have all that stuff, but we still have to have educate kids. We still have to have
Right.
safe neighborhoods we still have to have parks for our kids to play in. We still have to
Sure.
have, you know, roads that are safe to drive on and or suitable for whatever. We still have to conduct ourselves in a manner that is worth um admiring, or whatever. And
Sure.
so you can have those things, and but incrementally that stuff is encroached, and the people have aged out and died or left positions of power who had those values, and now the people who are in charge don't think that stuff is important. And I think that's one of the major shifts. Is before there was the bowling alley bumpers, we couldn't get too far out of whack because the people in charge wouldn't let it happen.
Right.
But now the people in charge are the advocates for this stuff, like the Alvin Bragg, the DA in New York. As we're
Yeah.
recording this now, the two cops are just beat up by these four quote unquote migrants, which
Right.
I got to ask you about this migrant word later on, because migrants, it indicates that they're like on the move. These
Right.
people are not on the move.
No, no.
Anyhow, in New York City, these, 4 or 6 or whatever it is, illegal aliens like accost these two cops, beat them up pretty
Yeah.
good.
Very
And
bad.
then the DA let him out with no bail. And,
Yeah.
and shocking. I know you'll be surprised to hear this. They left. They didn't stick around for their court date. It's wild. I
They're
know it's hard to
migrants.
believe.
They're running. They're migrants,
But
right?
but that's a great example. Like the DA of Manhattan
Yeah.
is now an advocate for this lawlessness, which before the DA would be like the buck stops there. You
Sure.
can go so far, but the DA would be like, no, where common sense will prevail. Well, now common sense doesn't prevail because the people in charge don't like the common sense.
Well, and I think what has become predominant then is a social belief system that now predominates over just physical reality. Because
Right.
you cannot have, I think that I don't think if you got any of these people, Alvin Bragg or any of these people in a room, and put the light on them and grilled them, that they could make a logical case for why you should let people who steal cars, etc., go, but or not prosecute people that assault people on the street. I don't think anybody they could really make a
Yeah,
logical
I don't know if
case.
it'd be logical, but I think in many cases they believe it. This is a way to level the playing field.
Well, and that's it. Yeah, that's what I mean by it's a social standard that
Yeah.
has taken precedence. It's elevated above just the basics that have kept us surviving as a society. So you have to have
Right.
as a human being, you've got to have some basic needs met. You've got to have a shelter, you have to have food, you have to have water,
Yeah.
you have to have air. There's certain things that are required for a human being to exist. There are certain things that are required for a society to exist, and those things are some sort of cohesion. There's some degree of acceptance of laws, of I'm not going to hurt you and you don't hurt me.
Yeah.
So there's all of that. But and I think that's kind of the main point here, is that the basic things that are inarguable, I mean, they're just inarguably the most important things for keeping a society from completely imploding, have been subjugated below the need for and there's real social problems. I mean, this is not to
Right.
say that we don't have social problems, or there's not inequalities, and there's not, people doing wrong and treating other people poorly. That has happened, and it does happen. So
Sure.
that's not to say that things were perfect beforehand, but it is to say that when the societal feeling is that nobody essentially can do anything worthy of, and I'm just on the crime issue at this moment, anything really worthy of getting stuck in jail or protecting your property rights as a human being, then you've got a society that is rushing headlong into implosion, into collapse, because
Yeah.
it's physically not, it physically isn't going to work. It's physically not going to work.
Yeah, a couple things come to mind when you as you're saying that. One of them is just this idea of instant gratification is now the priority.
Sure. Yes.
And maybe even instant gratification for the individual is now placed at a higher level than long-term success for the collective.
Right.
So things like education, potholes, trash, crime, that kind of stuff, that stuff is necessary for long-term success because it creates habits and it creates expectations that in the long term will play out well.
Right.
That stuff's being foregone for short term immediate gratification for individuals. I don't want to do my homework, and I have the right immutable characteristics, and therefore I don't have to. So why
Right.
would I? Well,
Yeah.
that feels good in the moment. However, let's check in on those people in 18 years and see how that's working out. And if it doesn't work out, we can always just say, well, that's because of racism, and that's because of what are the isms now? We got racism
Racism,
and
sexism.
sexism. Yeah, yeah, that's
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it feels to me like that's one thing. And then, like you said on the other point was you can ignore reality for only so long. Like I heard this thing a couple of days ago. Or I saw it, read it, or heard it. And it was something like you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring
Yeah.
reality, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I kind of like that's what we're doing, because if you look, people might be listening to this and going, "Well, who cares? What's the harm?" Well, here's the harm. Other countries aren't going to lower their standards like this.
That's right.
And maybe even other countries who don't wish us all that well aren't going to lower their standards
Right.
like this. I suspect China is not dropping their educational standards to the level we are.
Right.
I suspect Russia probably is not. I suspect other countries just won't. So we can argue that that's not fair or whatever, but let's fast forward. Let's just let this play out 100 years and look and see where our place in the world will be, and it would be substantially a lower quality of life than we have now.
Right.
And again, the instant gratification for the people living now, they feel that that's a big enough deal to say, yeah, that's okay. Who cares about my grandkids? Which is a
It's a
wild thing
horrible.
to think.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's 180 degrees from the people who gave their lives in the Second World War or the Civil War
Right.
or the Revolutionary War for their children and their friends' children and grandchildren, people they would never even know. They felt a duty to do that. And now, whether it's the debt we're taking on or the lower standards for education, lower standards for how we again, just the environment, as far as like the garbage we're in and the how quality roads and
Right.
just how ugly the stuff is now, like people are just willing to say my right to not have to do anything supersedes your right to enjoy life.
Well, and I wonder. So here's a philosophical question about this. It was probably in the 60s or 70s when that phrase came out. If it feels good, do it. Right. The late
Yeah.
60s, early 70s. Now, I don't perceive that when flower children or the boomers in that age were saying, if it feels good, do it, they meant stealing your neighbor's car. And I mean, maybe they
Right.
did, but I don't think that I think that those folks are looking at modern society and seeing that principle play out in ways that they did not expect. I mean,
Yeah.
so is it inevitable then? So the question becomes, is it inevitable when you get that kind of attitude that says the only important thing, the only thing that carries weight in our society is how a person feels about themselves, right?
Yeah.
And how other people feel about them. So I have to feel about you that you, regardless of what you've done, regardless of what you're doing, regardless of anything in your background, I have to feel
You
about
must
you.
celebrate me no matter what.
I must
That's right.
celebrate you. Your
That's
merit,
right.
a
Well,
meritocracy is
not me
racist.
because I'm a straight white male, so I'm excluded from this, of course.
Well,
But
yeah, you're
anyone
excluded.
else, you must
So I could
celebrate.
use you
Yeah.
as an example then. Yes, that works well. But I wonder if it's inevitable when that rather limited statement, probably in the 70s, if it feels good, do it, became really popular to say. I wonder if it's inevitable from that point on that we reach where we're at right now. And therefore, I wonder if it's inevitable that in future generations, so we're going to, after this crisis era is over, we're going to get to some sort of societal cohesion again. Don't know what it's going to look like, but we'll
Yep.
get to something. And then there will be a gradual then breakdown, because that's what human beings do, of
Yeah.
society again. And is it always inevitable that you start to elevate the individual's feelings and their individual's right to feel validated? I think that's it. Right to feel validated, regardless of what you've done in your life, regardless of what you're doing, and regardless of the way you impact the world. Is that inevitable that society breaks down along those lines? It seems to me it might be.
I I don't I don't think so, and I'll tell you why.
Okay,
So let me go back to what you started with, like in the late '60s, early '70s. If you feel this could do it, I'm imagining that the backdrop of that though, or the status quo was, coming out of World War II, it was very solemn, very somber, very
yep,
duty bound. I mean, I look at pictures, look at pictures of my family back then, and like nobody smiles. There's
yeah,
no like
that's right.
smiling in pictures was not a thing,
No,
and they're not frowning. They're
right,
just they're just they're just not smiling.
monotone.
And I've seen other pictures from those eras where in the 40s, it was a solemn time. It was a
Yeah,
sober time. It was a duty bound time. So with that as the environment, I would probably have been a person in the 60s who said, "Hey, how about we have some fun too, right? Like it's okay to like live a little here, right?"
sure,
That makes total sense with that somber, sober tone being the backdrop. Then you inch forward 25 years, and now we have like maybe some balance, and maybe by the 80s, probably we had a pretty good what you and I would consider balance between duty and entitlement,
sure,
and but with that as the backdrop now, and you say, well, if it feels good, do it. And if I screw it up, like there's always somebody in charge. There's always a Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan or somebody in charge to make sure things don't get too far screwed up.
right, yes,
Like,
yeah,
what impact could little old me have, or my band of friends or whatever?
right,
We're gonna just have fun and do whatever feels good. But as that balance, as that scale drifts more towards we do what feels good and less towards the duty bound, sober, solemn responsibility piece, I do think that in our case, it's inevitable so far that it has gone that way. You look at the Roaring '20s before the Great Depression.
yes, right,
You look at what the mood led up to the Civil War and things
hmm
like that. Now, where I think it's not always inevitable is I look at a country like Japan and I look at a country like China, where the social, the societal collective need is prioritized over the will of the individual, and the
sure,
individuals are measured by how much they contribute to the
society,
collective.
yeah,
So I heard somebody a couple weeks ago explain, like, they were saying, like, well, why did people go along with the communism in China? And the answer they proposed was because here's the unwritten deal in China right now is we're going to make you wealthy and you're going to give up all your rights in exchange for that.
sure,
And by and large, they have.
yeah,
The people in China live a much different lifestyle than they did
oh,
40 years
absolutely, yes,
ago.
exactly,
Like in many, I don't know about most, but many cases, like it's dramatically, like almost immeasurably different the
yeah,
lifestyle they have, and what they've sold in return is their rights,
yeah,
their individual rights. But they're willing to make that trade off. It benefits them to support the collective more than it would benefit them to do what feels good in the moment.
Sure.
So in that case, I don't think it would be inevitable. Now, how that's going to play out in China, I don't know. I think that the problem with all these things, as you and I have talked about almost on repeat here, is these are human being problems.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
get out of balance. We
Yeah.
take things too far. We want things we can't have. Then when we get those things, we want something different.
Right.
And we
Grass
have
is
a
always
higher
greener.
expectation of other people's behavior than we have of our own. And there's just all these things that lead to a constant, like, it's like the ocean. I kind of imagine it, just the
Yeah.
ocean of just like big waves crashing into bigger waves and smaller waves that are within the big waves and whatever. And I just think that some degree of chaos is always inevitable. I don't know if it's always going to be what we are doing, where we go from the sober, solemn, responsible, duty bound thing to just living like you shouldn't have a care in the world and there's no such thing as gravity anymore, because
Right.
one day gravity comes calling whether you like it or not. One
Yeah.
day the central bank can't print any more money. One day the
Right.
stock market will crash. One day your kids won't be able to get a job or whatever. And I know I'm rambling here, but before I let you respond, I saw a thing yesterday. It was a handful of college students. Now, this wasn't Harvard, but it wasn't Green River Community College either.
Right.
It was a college students. Like, it was like a state school or something like that. And there was a handful of them. And somebody asked them what 15 times 4 was. How many out of this handful, maybe 4 or 5 or 6, how many do you think got the answer, Dave?
I'm scared to, I mean, the cynic in me says 0.
0.
Yeah.
These are college. These are college kids. So okay. And I laugh like, what's the big deal? But there will be consequences for that. There will be consequences, when not just for those handful of individuals who, if they continue doing what feels good in the moment, will just go home and smoke weed and whatever. But for that collective generation, there's
Right.
going to be consequences.
Well, it's interesting too, the examples you used of, for instance, China and Japan, because I think there's another factor in there that makes it more challenging for us as Americans, and that is that Japanese society, and I'm not an expert on Asian cultures
Right.
or anything, but it's a very it's a very monoculture society to a great extent.
100%.
I mean, they've you don't find a lot of necessarily, you don't find the diversity there that you find here.
Yeah, you and I would not fit in China and Japan any more than we fit in here.
We would, yeah, that's right. We wouldn't fit in at all. Yeah, I mean, we don't look the part.
Right.
And I think that, and if you look at some of the European nations too, to a certain extent, a lot of the European nations, even there's a lot of immigration that's happening in European nations, but there's still, to be French is to be French. I think there's a lot of cohesiveness in long-term shared culture that we don't have here. Now, that's not to say that what we've got here isn't good. That's not to say that the diversity that I think we've been able to, at least up until recently, we've been able to meld the cultures from all over the world, the Irish, the German, and the Japanese, and the Africans, everybody, and come up with something that's really pretty unique and powerful in the world. I mean, our success argues for itself. But I think it puts us in a place where it's a lot easier to pick apart a culture like ours. It's such a diverse culture, because you can set up group after group after group that can be hostile to group after group after other group. I mean, the big thing that we have in the college system right now, it's been debated, and the Supreme Court says no, you can't have affirmative action on the in college admissions, because in Harvard, people that qualified by merit, like a lot of Asian folks that had qualified by merit, weren't allowed to go to Harvard, so that other folks that didn't qualify by merit were able to go because they were historically disadvantaged. And, you understand the arguments behind that. I understand the arguments about, historical disadvantage, et cetera. So, but the question is then, how can you create a cohesive culture out of that doesn't start fraying as much as ours has? I mean, in Japan, they've got a series of problems there, just like China's got lots of problems, but I think there's that part of the cultural issue as well. It's easier for those who are, in particular, those who are cynical, to divide us up and pit us against each other. And as a result of that, we ignore then those basic fundamentals like keeping things safe. Japan, they don't
Yeah.
have, they've got strict gun control laws. Their crime isn't the way it is here. Why is that? I think a lot of that is a cultural reality.
Well, it's because people value the success of the collective
Yes.
more than they value doing what feels good in the moment.
Yeah. Well, and a lot
And
of the collective looks like them, thinks like them,
right.
has the
Yeah.
same
And
heritage as
yeah,
them.
100%. And I think that, you and I talked about this when we first started doing this podcast, which was, I wish people would give us the grace that our situation kind of demands, that
Yeah.
that we are trying to do something that's never historically been done.
Right.
I mean, I guess I shouldn't say never. In when Rome was the Roman Empire was huge.
Yeah.
But they they had people of different ethnicities and cultures within the empire, but they largely kept them getting along by force.
Yeah, and they kept them a
There
lot of
wasn't.
in their regions.
Yeah.
They kept,
There wasn't in the Roman Senate, there wasn't representation from the Gauls.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
That wasn't a thing. So we've tried to do something that is historically not really been tried before, which is take all these people of different ethnicities and have them all have a different thing to unify them besides their immutable characteristics that you're talking
Right.
about. And I agree with you 100% that this idea of trying that is only a couple hundred years old.
Yeah.
Right. And before that, 100% of how people judge how much they would take somebody's input in, how much they trusted in, how much they would like them, how much they would allow their kid to marry them, how much they would want to live by them, was by how they looked.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it was all these, basically tribes, or in some cases cultures that were just giant tribes, but tribes nonetheless.
Right.
And we are trying to do something that's completely different from that, and saying, can we be sophisticated and mature enough to look past those immutable characteristics and try to find something greater than those to unite us?
That's it.
And I would say largely we've been successful with
Yes.
some major hiccups in the road.
Oh, yeah.
Like the one we're in now.
Yep.
The one we're in now, I would say, is not that much different than the Jim Crow era. Like, we're just picking
Yep.
different targets, but we got to find people to hate. We got to
Yep.
threaten to kill them, and we got to threaten to hurt them, and we got to, and again, as you and I have said over and over again, there's only two ways this unfolds in the world history. One is our tribe feels superior to yours because God gave us this ability, this superior to yours, or your tribe did something so bad to us, we're entitled to retribution.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
That's the story
Right.
of humankind.
Yeah, and it does make us uniquely vulnerable in the
Right.
West to, and we've exported a lot of that to Europe and other places as well. So it does make
Yeah.
us uniquely vulnerable to the dissolution that comes when tribalism, what we talked about last week, when it becomes the predominant value. So I think that's one of the things that for Kenny
And for
G in the
anyone who
future.
thinks I'm exaggerating, by the way, in case by some fluke of nature this podcast survives, but Twitter doesn't, or YouTube doesn't, or whatever, I literally watched a guy who's a very good chance of becoming the prime minister for South Africa, the country South Africa, talking about how he's not currently calling for the genocide of white people.
That's comforting.
He's not currently calling for the killing of, and he didn't say genocide, he said a different word, but like he meant mass killing.
Yeah.
And they asked him, well, does that mean that you might in the future? He goes, well, I can't really tell the future. I'm just saying right now, today, I'm not doing that.
Very comforting.
And there's
I'm sure
4 million people who are white who live in that country.
Yeah.
And it's no different than what Hitler said. And there's zero news coverage of it in anywhere in the world. Like, it's only through quote unquote fringe news sources. But it's a 6-minute video of the guy talking and like being interviewed by a reporter, and people. And this is what I think is important for Kenny G to understand. And Kenny G is the person, 70 years from now, for those of you who have not listened a lot, Kenny G is a fictitious character, but who will be a real life person living 70 years from now or so, as they're going through the next, winter on the big calendar, the crisis era, as Dave and I call it, but also some folks call it the winter season in our society, which happens every 80 to 100 years. I think it's important that Kenny G understand, like, this is what this moment is like. These things are happening, but powerful forces who don't want to be outed as supporting these things keep it at bay. And so there's a ton of friction based on who hears what.
Right.
And we have a real change in how our news is distributed and received, and people are living in different realities almost.
Yeah.
You know, if I were to ask, you know, if I were to ask people I know fairly well who maybe have a different value set than me, but who I like, by the way, and probably who at least used to like me, maybe not so much anymore. But if I were to ask them, like, do you think there's any world leaders right now calling for the genocide of people of other races? They would say Donald Trump,
Yeah, that's right.
and they would have no idea what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this guy
Yeah.
who does not look like Donald Trump, and he's calling for the execution of white people. Like, it's a wild time.
Well, it does go to, I think human beings retreat into sort of mind spaces, if you will, when things get tough. They retreat into comfortable places in their mind that
Right.
are supported by their ideology. So if we retreat into the space, if in South Africa, they retreat into the space of, well, we were oppressed by apartheid, literal apartheid,
Yeah.
which they were,
Yeah, they
for a
were.
very long time. And therefore, it's comfortable to think of this thing that I'm not going to fully articulate or fully say I want, but it could happen. I think that becomes a comfortable place for people to retreat into when things get when they either get too powerful or when people get too scared of what's going on around them. I think those
Yeah.
are real things that happen. And I think then the narratives, the social narratives at that point become the most important thing above the physical realities that we see around us. And I think this is this is kind of my main point in this for Kenny G, and that is when you see the social narratives becoming more important and more weighty and valuable to to decision making, to the core function of society, than the basics of physical societal functioning and survival, then you're at that sort of end point in this sort of crisis era. You're at the end point of any hope of resolving the conflict without, you know, a serious type of crisis event. I mean, we
Yeah.
hope it doesn't happen. We hope it's mild. We hope it's, maybe there'll be a skirmish between two minor nations, and we can have a little tiny world war and be done with it and move
Yeah.
on to something good. But
Yeah.
unlikely.
I gotta think, looking way down the road, and maybe I'm too optimistic. If I'm looking like 2 or 5,000 years from now, I gotta figure that they have this stuff figured out, right? We
I
would
don't
be
know, Brian.
beyond
I don't know.
race wars and things like that. But again, I say maybe I'm too optimistic because I look backwards 2,000 years,
Yeah.
and we're doing about the same thing now as we did then. Like you know, again, how the Roman Empire operated is not much different from how we're operating,
Yeah.
where there's a lot of corruption by people in high power. People who are wealthy get to manipulate things, and then people who are not wealthy take retribution and they kill those people, and bad things happen to them. And lessons are learned, and then over the course of 40 to 60 to 80 years, those lessons are forgotten, and we do the same thing all over again.
Well, and I mean, 2,000 years isn't very long in human history. Go back to the Sumerians, in the
Yeah,
ancient Mesopotamia. Go back, and archaeology tells us over and over and over that basically peoples live the same story all the time. We just
right.
human beings for it depends on who you ask, but maybe we've got 10,000 years of recorded history. Not very good records back 10,000 years, but 5,000 years, 7,000 years. You look at all these discoveries of cuneiform tablets, and what are the stories that they tell? They're basically the same stories you read on Facebook or Twitter,
Right.
now known as X, today. So
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of confidence. I think it's a feature of the human operating system. Now, I mean, maybe they'll program it out of us or something, and there'll be genetic engineering. I don't know. I don't have much hope in that either.
Yeah, I it's hard to it's hard to say. I guess long term, I mean, eventually 20,000 years, maybe at some point we're gonna have to. I would think we'd figure this stuff out, but in the
Well,
short
maybe
term,
when we get to space, maybe when we can separate far enough from each other that, we can be mad at the people in the other solar system, and we just can't get there to kill them.
right. Yeah, that would unite us. When if we had an enemy bigger than the entire planet, that would unite us as one common people against a foe that's from Alpha Centauri or whatever.
There
I
you go.
suppose I suppose that might do it.
That could.
Well, and like you're talking earlier about these things that just don't make sense. These fringe ideas, they just keep
Yeah.
going and going and going at the expense of things that are really necessary. What are some of the things that you see that are just blatantly necessary that are just being completely missed in favor of these more modern outlooks? I'll call them.
Well, I mean, so let's take a look at what governments focus on. So, let's take a look at the things that they pass. I'll give you a few practical examples. One of the examples that is happening in Washington State right now is they're attempting to allow governments to take, and this is very regional and local and modern.
Yeah.
They're allowing them to raise the amount of money they can tax people on their property taxes, but there's no explanation of why that money is needed by somebody in government. We just need more money. Why? Well, we just need more money. So, in the past, there would have been this idea that, well, this is happening, that's happening. We need more money for these things. So therefore, we're going to raise a tax on this to do this or that or the other thing.
But here's the thing I think has changed though. In 1950, on the heels of these people in charge literally saving the world,
Yeah.
and having demonstrated that they were duty bound to the society and they
Yes.
had an obligation to serve the society, they had earned the right to say that something like that, and people would give them the benefit of that because they had earned it.
Well, they they
They had
demonstrated.
demonstrated
Yeah.
this stuff for sure, and then over time they use that credibility, but they've not earned it, and not only they not earned it, they're actually using it for nefarious purposes.
Right.
But they're just flat out lying. But they're stealing the credibility of the people who came before them, who actually did serve the people.
Well, and those that we trusted to run our society in those days, those that had a high sense of duty, they also felt a sense of duty to explain what they were doing to a certain extent,
Right.
a lot more
100%.
than today. So, as an example, there was just a number of like local counties, cities, etc., have been voting on resolutions regarding the war in between Hamas and Israel. It's like,
Yeah.
dude, I got garbage lining my street out here, and you're spending your time talking about something you have zero impact on. Nothing.
Yeah.
You cannot do one little thing about that. If
You're
you
talking
don't
about
like
San
it,
Francisco, right? Was it the San Francisco City Council
they did that, but it's not just it's all
or
over the
Oakland?
place.
Maybe.
I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
there was somebody here in Washington State that was doing that, and I'm like, how is it? How is this a useful, realistic expenditure of time and effort on your part when I got some homeless folks over here, when I got garbage lining the streets, and
Because they get to look righteous,
they
Dave.
get
You
to
don't
look
understand.
socially righteous.
They get
Yes,
to look righteous and more sophisticated and more evolved than rubes like me and you who want garbage picked up. Like,
that's right.
get your shit together, Dave. That's on the scale of things. That's so low. Now us, if they would just listen to us, we could solve world peace in no second of the city council of Seattle or Tacoma or Oakland or San Francisco. All of these places happen, and me proclaiming that I am this wise, righteous person definitely is more important than your garbage problem.
Well, and see, and again, that's an illustration of that exact same thing, that
Yeah,
that social standing and sort of the, do I hold the right opinions, takes precedence over, do I do the right things? Am I doing the
yeah,
right, as city council people, I here's the things I want you to concentrate on. They should be within the city limits of this area, shouldn't they? I mean, it
yeah.
seems logical to me. It seems very basic to me. But
Well, again,
the
it comes down to we value people on the other tribe on their outcomes, and we value our people on our intentions,
our
right? And they do
intentions,
the same.
exactly right. Yep. That's
The
exactly right.
people who vote for those people say, yeah, but their intentions are really good. Like, who wouldn't want world peace? And
Right.
yeah, there's some garbage to walk around and some needles. You can't take your kid to the park anymore, and you probably shouldn't even take him to school anymore. But man, these guys have really good intentions about solving that problem half a world away they can do nothing about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that lasts until reality comes to bite you in the butt.
Yeah.
That's going to last for a
It's
little
like
while.
going all in poker. It works every time, right up until it doesn't.
Until it doesn't work anymore. And and I think that's one of the things that Kenny G in the future has got to watch for. When society
Yeah.
becomes so unpinned from reality, becomes so unpinned from basic concepts such as merit, and becomes so unpinned from concepts such as keeping people safe, public safety, or whatever the physical thing is, and becomes only about the positions and the words you say and how you say them, then
Yeah.
you're at the
And
end.
I think if I was to counsel Kenny G on things to look for, maybe this is something that you and I can work in regularly is like indicators to look for. I think the one I would start with is start keeping track of the times that you think or say they wouldn't do that, would
They
they?
wouldn't do that.
And
Yeah.
then it happens.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it might happen for 4 years, it might happen in 6 months, and who knows how long. But all these things that we think, okay, they can do this, but they wouldn't go that far.
Right.
And then you go, holy shit, they went that far and a little further. Um, that's when you start ticking those things off mentally or whatever.
Right.
That's when you know that you're heading in the direction here. Before we wrap up, Dave, I want to share something with you that a couple weeks ago I shared something with you about something I was sad that Kenny G would not get to experience, and that
Oh,
of
yeah.
course was the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition that's not going to be printed anymore.
Did you bring one out from
And
your
today I
collection?
thought I would share something. What's that?
Did you bring one out from your collection?
I did. I don't have a collection anymore. I did at one time. I probably had about 12 or 15,
Yeah.
but I had the good ones. Elle
Oh, yeah.
McPherson and Kathy Ireland.
Oh,
I
there
had
you
all
go.
the good ones. Yeah, and I had most of them. Some of the pages might have been bad shape, but I had most of them.
I don't want to talk about it.
Anyhow, uh, I saw something yesterday, I thought to myself, I hope Kenny G, or I'll be glad if Kenny G doesn't have to experience this.
Yeah.
And that is a pretty famous guy, Toby Keith, died yesterday.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I heard that.
And very well liked by many, many people.
Yeah.
Some folks not a big fan, whatever, fine. But I saw this phenomenon happen, and I was like, holy crap, if that is not a representation of what life is like in this moment. And somebody had put a thing on social media that said, RIP Toby Keith. And a reply came from a person that said, he's not resting, he's walking with Jesus. Now, that's fine. But I thought, why is there this urge to constantly overlook the 80% to correct the 20%?
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and again, I'm sure the person had good intentions, but
Yeah.
this is the moment, the vibe we're in. This is what it's like to have exchanges of ideas with people.
Yeah.
They overlook all the things you say that are absolutely 100% accurate, and they reach for that part that they can find the disagreement with. Now,
Right.
so in this case, maybe too silly of an example. They both were obviously wishing well for this man who
Sure.
they liked a lot and had
Yeah.
whatever. But instead of just saying agreed, saying I think the same thing, she had to find this way to say, yeah, but my way is a little bit better. My way is a little bit different.
You got to stand out.
And that is the way it is with all this stuff. All the things you're talking about, like the garbage, yeah, the garbage should be picked up, but we'll get to that someday.
Yeah.
Or we got bigger things to take care of. Or we got to keep Donald Trump out of office. Like there's this constant, but 85% of what you're saying is true, but I'm going to find that 12% that maybe you can't prove. I'm going to find that 1% that you can't prove, or it's just this constant looking for things to find a disagreement about,
Right.
where there's no need to find disagreement about. And I thought, over a person dying, like, really, you freaking weirdo? Like, why would you? I wasn't thinking weirdo about this woman when I read this thing. I really didn't have kind things to think about her. I don't know who she is. She's some random person. I'll never know who it was. But it's like, why here? Why can't you just wish the man well and move on with your day? Why does it have to be a correction? Why do we have to find a way to show that I'm more righteous than you in how I think of this thing, or I'm wiser than you, or but your idea is kind of okay, but mine's much better. This but nonsense. Holy crap, is that exhausting? And I think part of what leads to us not be able to resolve anything.
It is. It's the elevation of the YouTube star. It's
Yeah.
basically everybody wants to be Mr. Beast. Everybody wants to
Yeah.
be the one that everybody watches. You know, when we were kids, people wanted to, you wanted to stand out by something. You hit a home run on the baseball team or whatever. But now it's like, I want to be the one that makes the last point. And everybody's, oh,
Right.
yeah, you really took it to him, right? I mean, everybody wants
The
to
last
be.
point, or the one to look a little more sophisticated, a little more evolved, a little more wise, a little more righteous. Like it's and this again, she wasn't like slamming the door on guy and saying you're
Sure.
100% wrong. It wasn't like that at all.
Right.
She just had to demonstrate that she was a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I'm tired of that,
That's a
man. I'm
common
really tired of
societal
that.
value now. And you're right. I mean, if we could all just, can't we just all, what was Rodney King? Can't we all just get
Yeah.
along?
In her case, can't we all just shut up? Like, how about you just be quiet and
Right.
just like think your own thoughts to yourself, and
Yeah.
you don't have to have a compulsion to show somebody else that you're all these things.
Right.
Which is ironic coming from a guy who's doing a podcast talking about how screwed up everything
Well,
is.
I mean, we're on the top, so that's too bad for them, you know.
That's right. Well, hey, like we said earlier, and we say every single time, we truly want to know where you think we get it right and where you think we get it wrong. What Dave and I are trying to do is explain to somebody living 70 years from now what this moment in time is like. And we obviously have our thoughts on how it's going, but we would love to hear what you think. And if you think we completely missed something, jump in and tell us. Go to unsilentpodcast.com or go to our Rumble channel. There's a great comment section on the Rumble page. You can comment on any of the videos. If you're watching on Rumble, don't be afraid to hit that little thumbs up button or the like button. It's Dave and Brian against the algorithm. That's how this game is played.
Right.
And but for real, we'd love to hear your comments and see what you think as far as if we get it right or not. Again, unsilentpodcast.com or Rumble. And until next week, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.